I'm speaking with Dr. Larry Kaplan, author of Pershing's Tankers, Personal Accounts of the AEF Tank Corps in World War I. Thank you for speaking with me.
Oh, you're very welcome.
So first, tell me how you got into studying and writing on this subject.
I'd be happy to, Chris. I'm a military historian by profession, and when I started my career off as an Army historian at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the early 1990s, the library at Fort Sill that supported the Field Artillery School had been started around 1915 or so. And the library there was one of the finest libraries in the Army system for many years, up until a fire in the late 1920s destroyed a number of the books and the like. But the point is that the librarian at that time was busily collecting and gathering information across the Army of things that were pertinent to the Army's growth, not just related to field artillery. And so in the early 1990s, I came across a report that was written, a file copy, that was produced at the tank school at Fort George Meade, Maryland, right after World War I, where the tank school was located. And it was a report of personal experiences of tankers in the First World War. And the report had about 35 of these personal experience reports. These were all transcribed, and the file copy was one of many that the tank school would have sent to Army libraries across the country. And at that time, I said, wow, this is really pretty interesting. You know, at some future time, if nobody has done this, I'll see about making this into a publication. So in the course of my career, I just retired this last February with a little over 28 years of government service. And I've had a number of other publications before this. And so I did get to working on this after some of my earlier projects. About 7 or 8 years ago, I said, boy, I'm going to get back to looking into this business with these tank reports. And I gathered a few additional reports from the papers of a former tank officer in the American Expeditionary Forces, the AEF, Joseph Viner. The tank school and the tank museum and the like had been at Fort Knox, Kentucky for many, many years, but much of that had moved to Fort Benning, Georgia a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So the papers of Joseph Viner were there, and they had a few of these personal experience reports that I added to the 35 that I had. And then I went to the George Patton papers at the Library of Congress in Washington, and it may be of interest to your listeners that George Patton got his start in tanks and armor at this time with the AEF Tank Corps. He was one of the very first officers, as a matter of fact, in the AEF Tank Corps. He was on General Pershing's staff as a captain in late 1917 when he went over to Europe, and a year later he would be a colonel within a year's time, and played a major role as one of the brigade commanders of Tank Corps operations, which I'll discuss here in a little bit. So the Patton papers had several of these personal experience reports in them, but I was troubled that I saw that Patton had actually some original hand-signed reports in his papers. And this should have never, ever happened. As an Army historian, I can tell you that anything original should have been retired with the official records to the National Archives and Records Administration with the rest of the documentation for the AEF Tank Corps.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I thought it was peculiar, but okay, George Patton had a number of file copies. There was about a dozen or so of these reports. And he had one or two originals. And when I got back to my research, I had a quandary on my hands. One of the reports from the 1919 compendium done at the tank school was the exact same report I got from the Patton papers, but they were both attributed to different officers. So I said, well, okay, I can fix this. I'll go to the National Archives. I'll look at the microfilm and find all of the original reports, and I can at least straighten out which officer wrote this report that was attributed to one officer in the Patton papers and another officer in these tank school reports. So this is really probably one of the most interesting aspects of being a military historian. Now, I want to stop parenthetically before I tell you what's going to happen here.
Mm-hmm.
In World War I, 100 years ago, this year is the 100-year anniversary of the birth of the Tank Corps. Okay, prior to World War I, the U.S. Army didn't have a tank corps; it didn't have tanks.
Mm-hmm.
So the Tank Corps was established after we got in the war. In the AEF in Europe, they set up a tank corps there. There's a tank corps in the United States. They're both kind of working independently, but they cooperate a little bit. And there's a brigadier general, a cavalry general named Rockenbach, Samuel Rockenbach, and he's in charge of the tank corps in the AEF. And now we're building a new capability from scratch that the U.S. Army has never seen or done anything like this.
Mm-hmm.
So George Patton, as a captain, is put in charge of getting the training and the education off the ground. And he's going to get a series of promotions throughout 1918 to take him up to a colonel after the war. It's not a permanent promotion, because after the war he'll go back to a lower grade. But in the meantime, Patton plays a key role here. So what happens through most of 1918 into the summer of 1918 is they're recruiting from the tank corps from a variety of officers from other branches. They're pretty high standards. They'd like people to know something about how motor vehicles work and this, that, and the other, and have some technical skills. The American Army doesn't have any of its own tanks. There are plans that they're putting together to produce some, but the plans to have all of these battalions organized and train them in the U.S. and have them shipped over to Europe, train, man, and equip them, and figure out the right doctrine and tactics. A lot of that we were relying on the French and the British, who had already been in the war for a number of years, already had their own battle tanks. And so they're going to be the template for us. The French and the British are going to lend us equipment, or we're going to purchase it from them. They're going to help us with some of their doctrinal literature to get training off the ground that can be translated, and send it advisors and the like. And Patton's going to be working with these other people. And so the tank corps doesn't play a large role in World War I. That's what I'm getting to for your listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not a lot of literature written about the U.S. Army Tank Corps in World War I for that reason. The United States Army was only in the war for about a year and 9 months.
Mm-hmm.
The infantry played the major role, and artillery, of course. But tanks were in the war just towards the end of the war, just for about a 7-week period from mid-September to like the 1st of November. And in that period, all of these battalions that were being trained, only 3 Army battalions ever participated in combat operations for that 7-week period.
Mm-hmm.
That included one heavy battalion of tanks that the British had provided. And the British were the ones that introduced with this big heavy tank that could break through barbed wire and the like. It's called the Mark IV, and then they improved it to about a Mark V and several different variations of that. The thing weighed about 30 or 35 tons, and you could put about a dozen men in it, and it could be armed with cannons or machine guns or both. And it's slow lumbering vehicle that moved about maybe 2 miles an hour, 2.5 to 3 miles an hour. And the French, meanwhile, had developed some of their own tanks, and the U.S. Army found that we were interested in, and they had a light tank. It was a 2-man tank done by the Renault company, and it could move a little more quickly than those larger tanks.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 3 battalions that are going to participate in the war are the 301st Tank Battalion that are attached under the British. And then there are 2 light tank battalions with these Renault tanks called the 344th and 345th Tank Battalions. And they're going to be armed with these light Renault tanks. Now, George Patton, because he's training these light tankers in France, the heavy tankers are getting trained separately in England. That's far away from Patton. But Patton becomes the brigade commander of these two battalions during the war. And so the French provide these Renault tanks in the summer of 1918, somewhere around August, I believe. And these people are training on these things. They're going into combat with them in about a month or so later. Mm-hmm. So they did the best they could with what they had. They didn't have a lot of time and experience with this equipment, the familiarity with it. Nobody expected the war to end in November 1918 in the U.S. Army. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. Army was planning that they figured the war would probably go on to about the spring of 1919. So as the AEF Tank Corps was being put together and trained and manned and equipped, and George Patton was playing a key role in this under the auspices of Brigadier General Rockenbach, there was also an arrangement made between the British and the French and the Americans to mass-produce tanks that would go to the various armies. Now, the Americans entered into a collaborative agreement with the British to produce like the be-all and end-all of super tanks by the end of World War I. It was called the Mark 8 tank, the Anglo-American tank. Mm-hmm. None were actually produced by the end of the war, but they had big facilities, a big factory facility in France, and they expected that the British and the Americans want to collaborate, that each provide different parts that would be put together, finalized at this tank facility. And the war ended, as I indicated, before any of those big tanks were produced. In the U.S. Army today, there are only two of them left. One of them is at the museum at Fort George Meade, which the museum is in the process of closing. And I'm not sure, but I think the other one may be down at Fort Benning with the Tank Museum. But they're really a sight to see. It's the technological end state of tank development in World War I. Okay, so back to my main theme of what was going to happen when I went to the National Archives. And I just gave you a kind of an idea that tank operations were not all that enduring. They lasted for a short amount of time. When I went to the archives, I discovered, to my amazement, that there were no personal experience reports in the archives. None. All of those records, I don't know what happened to them. They don't know what happened to them, but they're not there. Mm-hmm. Which helps explain even more so why nobody has ever written a book putting all of these together.
Right.
If you check the literature on World War I tanks, there's only a handful of books. Mostly books about World War II tanks might have an introductory chapter about World War I. And I've seen 3 or 4 of these personal experience reports printed in just general books about U.S. Army armored history and warfare. Mm-hmm. And those were from the Patton papers. That's all very well and good. As I said, the Patton papers have about a dozen of these things. So it became evident to me that the file copy of reports that I had from Fort Sill in a field artillery library might be the only extant copy of that report left in the entire U.S. Army. Mm-hmm. In other words, this is lost history. It's now going to come to light. And it was, as a historian, of course, it's wonderful to find something new that nobody has done. Mm-hmm. But what I did is I found something old that I had an assumption that everybody knew about, and it was a false assumption. Mm-hmm. Nobody knew anything about these reports, these 35 reports from World War I, because if they had, they certainly would have published them by now. Mm-hmm. So that in and of itself is a rarity in this day and age for military history, when we assume everything worth printing or publishing has already been printed or published, and the researchers have scoured through everything that should have been published.
Right.
And so this is an anomaly. This is a historical anomaly. So now it explains why George Patton had 1 or 2 of the original reports in his papers. Because maybe he collected them in his capacity for General Rockenbach, and maybe he held on to them. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do know is those things never made it into the National Archives. And if I can use an analogy, we had a big brouhaha a few years ago here about Secretary Clinton's emails,
mm-hmm.
about the laws that the emails were on the wrong server. Well, the point was is the emails were saved because of federal laws that you must save federal documents.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody's in dispute about that. That part is right. The emails were saved. Those same laws applied for the U.S. Army in World War I.
Hmm.
So for a lion's share of these documents to just disappear or be thrown out, it's not only against the law, but it's a terrible travesty.
Yeah.
And so it robs the Army of an important part of its history.
Mm-hmm.
Now, mind you, again, the file copy report at Fort Sill is there, and anybody can go see it. But it's counterintuitive to go to a field artillery installation looking for a report on armored warfare.
Huh. Okay. So
when I checked with the folks at the Fort Meade Museum, which inherited what was left of the tank school, they'd never known or seen or heard anything about these reports from World War I. I mean, it came as a complete surprise to them. And, of course, it came as a complete surprise to some other scholars and folks along my researches, not the least of which was a top-notch archivist at the National Archives named Patrick Osborne,
mm-hmm.
who I learned is actually writing a book on World War I tank operations in the AEF.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Osborne is the consummate expert on anything to do with tank operations in the AEF, and he was very helpful to me in collaborating with me on my particular project of these personal experience reports.
Mm-hmm.
So, in addition to the just reprinting these 35 reports, now supplementing them with others, my Pershing's Tankers book has 48 of these official reports in them.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
Now, what it doesn't have several other reports that I stumbled across that really bring nothing to the table about tank operations in World War I. These reports were, let me back up a little bit. General Rockenbach, right after the war ended, issued a memo to all the officers in France in the tank battalions to write about their personal experiences. Well, as I just said here, starting off, only 3 of the battalions actually participated in combat.
Right.
So a good number of the officers in those 3 battalions did write personal experience reports. Not all of them. At least if they wrote them, they no longer exist. I don't know where they are.
Mm-hmm.
But there were people in the other battalions that wrote them, and some of those ended up in Patton's papers or Colonel Joseph Viner's papers. And I deemed that they didn't bring anything to the table because, as I said, some of these folks were just talking about how they were mobilized, sent over to Europe on a ship, and then by the time they got there, the war ended. I mean, there's just no story.
Right.
So that part, I judiciously left that out. Now, the publisher limited me on the size of the manuscript. So I did have some other reports that I would like to have included that were not personal experience reports, just other reports that would have given some more insight into tank operations, but it would have made the book too long.
Okay.
But that's not all that important because those are the kind of things that are available elsewhere. Okay, so back to my point about now I've got 48 of these personal experience reports. Well, one of the benefits that we have today that we certainly didn't have, say, 30, 40 years ago or more, is now the Internet, with its digitization, makes it possible to find things you didn't even know existed. Okay. So I have over 20-some-odd additional personal experience reports that are unofficial, that are mostly from newspapers and magazines.
Oh, wow.
And so small-town newspapers would print letters that some fellow in the tank corps would send home to his family or friends, and they'd print them in the newspaper.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are really quite interesting. So I've got 20-some-odd of those, and the only difference between those official personal experience reports, whereas one's official and one's unofficial. I mean, if you read them both together, they sound similar.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So now I've got over 70 reports, and in addition to that, especially as an Army historian, I wanted to make sure that the readers had some additional context.
Right.
So now you've got these reports. Of course, I wrote an introduction giving the reader just a summary background of military operations and how they came about and this, that, and the other. But what I really take pride in is that General Rockenbach, his official reports of World War I, those have been reproduced, and you can read those. And they talk about the operations, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And General Rockenbach gives a few pages of background about the challenges he faced and how he had to get training up and this, that, and the other with the French and the British. And General Rockenbach also wrote an article or two, which I've taken portions of those and put into this book. But there's something that most people, as far as I know, have never looked at in writing about this period. And that's General Rockenbach's congressional testimony about tank operations right after World War I.
Okay.
I've taken that, edited it, to make it read like a narrative. And General Rockenbach explains to the listener how and why he made certain decisions and what he was particularly faced with. These are rare insights into how and why he did things that you're not going to read anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
And again, if you're just thinking in kind of one-dimensional terms when you're writing a history paper, you're looking for something published in the way of an article or a book or a memoir. But congressional testimony oftentimes has some just wonderful nuggets of gold tucked away in there.
All right. Yeah.
And for something like this with tank operations that hasn't been written about as extensively as operations in World War II, or for instance, I think that the readers will really benefit from that background context from General Rockenbach.
Mm-hmm.
So the components of the book include, again, nearly 50 of these personal experience reports arranged by battalion. There's one other sidebar I'd like to add here, since we have the time to do that.
Sure.
Is I wanted to get the senior commanders' personal experience reports in particular. So George Patton as the brigade commander over these two light tank brigades, that's good. There's a Major Sereno Brett, who was one of the battalion commanders, I think the 344th Light Tank Battalion. And there was a captain who was a 345th Battalion commander. I got him. But the 301st Tank Battalion with the British is lacking a personal experience report. And what I discovered is Major Roger B. Harrison, the battalion commander, was wounded. Okay, he was wounded late in the war, and so he never wrote a personal experience report. But now here's the great part of the story.
Yeah.
Roger B. Harrison was an infantry officer. 10 years later, or actually in the early 1930s, when he was going to the Infantry Officer Advanced Course at Fort Benning, Georgia, he wrote a lengthy paper about the operations of the 301st Tank Battalion. That paper is included in this narrative.
Oh, wow.
And it is a bird's eye view from the battalion commander walking you through nuts and bolts of every part of the operations of the 301st Tank Battalion.
Mm.
And so that's just, I think, a real hidden gem as well, to try to raise the quality of these things up and give the readers, a real good grounding from each of the battalion's perspectives, from the senior people down all the way down. Now, when I say all the way down, I want to emphasize that the memo that General Rockenbach sent was for the officers to write these reports.
Right. Yeah.
So, in a Renault tank, for instance, in a two-person Renault tank, you're going to have one officer and one enlisted man, as the tank driver.
Okay.
So you're not going to get everybody in the tank corps that conducted operations writing these reports. I just want to emphasize that.
Right.
But there are several of these reports that are written by enlisted people that later got commissions in the tank corps, and so their reports kind of vary, where they start off with some biographical background of how they got in the tank service, and they're an NCO, non-commissioned officer, and then towards the end of the report, they might even still be an NCO, but they're notifying you they just got a commission to be promoted. So because they were promoted and they were an officer at the time when the memo went out to write the reports, they qualified for writing a report. So in some cases, you actually do get from the bottom all the way up. You get the enlisted perspective, you get the officer perspective, you get the senior perspective, and that's a real value added of Pershing's tankers. And the value of just giving people's perspectives, if you like reading biography or what people think they thought they did, then you or others would find this of interest. If people just want to read about the operations of a particular unit, that they can do that elsewhere. I mean, you can get an overview for that in this book, as I said, but this book, heart and soul, is about the soldiers, from their perspective, what it was like being in the tank corps in the AEF in World War I. And I can say unreservedly that there is no other book like this that has ever been printed since World War I.
So the description of the book says, it talks, from these reports, it talks about, or you talk about manning, training, equipping, and that sort of thing. So, so a reader would get, as you said, would get a real feel of how it grew up, the tank.
That's correct. That's correct. And because you're going to get different perspectives of different people, George Patton himself, I got to say what, I mean, he's a very colorful character. And so his report, it's kind of, well, of course it's interesting to read, but he goes into a little bit of depth about the challenges he's faced on training, manning, equipping, and a variety of other officers. As I said before, they actually got into combat operations. The reader will get a very good flavor of what it was like entering this brand new tank corps that didn't have tanks, what happens when the tanks show up, what kind of training you were getting, what it was like when you got to be deployed, what it was like in combat, and so you get a whole stepping stone approach to the different facets of what these soldiers experienced and went through. It's not just people in a tank talking about fighting Germans. It's way, way, way more than that.
So it seems interesting that with these reports sort of lost to history until now, how the tankers of World War II grew from World War I. It seems like it was dependent on the personalities, the individuals in World War I staying in the Corps. Well,
that's not exactly what happened, because what happened is after World War I, the U.S. Army dismantled the tank corps.
Okay.
The tank school at Fort Meade, Maryland, was closed in 1931 or 32. And when the U.S. Army entered World War II, we didn't actually have any real battle tanks. Okay, we had to get back into the game. Of course, George Patton played a key role in that, and he was a senior officer at that point. But the handful of officers that served in World War I were long since retired or gone by World War II. It was a complete new generation. Now, there were some people that served, of course, in the tank corps in World War I that made it up to the higher ranks in World War II. I don't have a shopping list in front of me. And some cavalrymen like George Patton, who went back to the cavalry branch after World War I, and will later go back in World War II into the tank branch.
Okay.
But the American Army cut its teeth in World War I. They did away with the tank corps after World War I. And by the time we got in World War II, it was eminently clear that we really needed to up our game on armored warfare. And so we did that, along with upping our game on a whole variety of other capabilities in some of the other branches.
Okay. So
now, I'm glad you mentioned about Patton. I neglected to mention earlier that one of the components of this book contains about a half a dozen letters, personal letters that George Patton wrote to his wife and his father, most of them to his wife. Now, most of your listeners will probably, your aware of the story about George Patton slapping a soldier in World War II and getting himself in all kinds of trouble with his behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But I will tell you this. When you connect the dots, in World War I, if the soldiers had been more on their toes, or somebody wanted to turn George Patton in, by all rights, his career probably should have come to an end in World War I, and by all rights, he should have been kicked out of the Army. Because in a letter to his wife, he wrote, in the middle of an attack that he was involved in, the one where he earned the Distinguished Service Cross, that he thinks he killed an American soldier by hitting him on the head with a shovel because the soldier wouldn't follow his orders in advance with him.
Oh, wow.
Assaulting an American soldier is a court-martial offense.
Yeah.
If you say you think you killed somebody, you assaulted him. There is no record of George Patton being turned in for assaulting or killing a soldier. At that particular engagement, Patton had several of his staff around him. What happened was he was leading his his brigade, and he had some tanks off to one of the flanks. He had some of his own men with him. He came across an infantry company that was being held down by some German machine gun fire, and he wanted to attack and put these machine guns out of business. The officers of the infantry unit had been killed, and even though Patton at that time was a lieutenant colonel, the infantrymen would not follow his orders and follow him into combat against these machine guns.
Mm-hmm.
Patton was pretty much unsuccessful in his attack. He got some of his own men to go with him, but he ended up taking a .50 caliber machine gun bullet and getting a wound which earned him a Distinguished Service Cross.
Oh, okay.
It was at this particular engagement, when these infantrymen did not want to follow him, that he whacked one of these guys over the head with a over the head with a shovel.
Right.
And that's in his personal letter to his wife that was never, ever intended to be read by anybody but her.
Wow.
I'd like to remind you that these experience reports were never intended to be read by a civilian audience. Okay? George Patton's personal letters, which I think are very interesting in of themselves about how he was leading his brigade and what he was doing, those are certainly interesting. But these things were never intended to be seen by anyone's eyes but his wife's or his dad. So making this admission about assaulting a soldier is far worse than slapping a soldier in World War II.
Yeah, I would say so. Wow, that's quite interesting, and yeah. Considering the importance he played, though, in World War II, I'm sure, I don't know.
Well, the thing to know, again, when you connect the dots is that George Patton was an excellent tank commander, but he also had a volatile temper.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the thread that you pull across here. And that some of the personal experience reports talk about Captain and Major Patton training these soldiers at Langres, France at the training school, and what a great job he was doing. Because he could motivate his men, and this is just typical Patton. If you're a Patton aficionado, this is where you go to school on Patton, taking real command of real groups. I mean, George Patton in Mexico, people are not writing books about what he did in Mexico as a captain. He was on the staff of General Pershing. This is when he gets to be a real commander for the very first time in modern warfare, directing large bodies of troops. And so the men from the lower ranks give him his due and credit as an organizer and a leader. And that's the takeaway, showing how you're molding this leader that's going to be a great general in World War II.
Yeah. So for the 7 weeks, I think you said it was 7 weeks of action that they saw in World War I?
That's correct.
So how much of an effect did their actions have on, if they saved one guy, I think, that's important enough.
They played a very good role. I'm not going to say a critical role, but they played a very important role of providing armor support to American troops. as we advanced. And that's what armor is supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because it provides you direct fire support to your advancing infantry. And the heavy tanks, for instance, with the British, those were they had a few problems that the light tanks didn't. And admittedly, part of it had to do with the lack of training with the American troops that they were supporting. They supported several American divisions. And the very first battle that they were in, it didn't go well for them. They didn't play as much of an important role as they had hoped. Actually, the first battle up with the British in the Cambrai-St. Quentin sector, the British had neglected to tell the Americans that the American tanks were going over what used to be a British minefield. And so early in the battle, several American tanks were disabled by British landmines. So the lack of communications with the British right out of the starting blocks didn't work well on that. And then linking up with our infantry and trying to advance, that didn't work real well in the first battle. But things got better, and they went to school on that and improved in the second battle. Down further south, along the St. Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne offensives, where George Patton was involved with the 344th and 345th, the tanks, the light tanks, did the best they could with what they had. One of the problems they had is their tanks going out of commission or getting knocked out. So they had some real readiness issues going because the equipment it just didn't sustain itself long enough to stay in the fight continually. But when it was in the fight, it played a valuable role of helping the Americans move forward and capture territory.
Do you think the presence of American tankers along the lines had a morale effect on the Germans at all?
Oh, no question about it. The presence of tanks had a great morale effect just on our troops. And certainly the Germans were fearful of tanks, not just American tanks, but tanks in general. So for the short time the American the AEF Tank Corps participated in the war, they could be proud of their contributions. They had a number of Medal of Honor winners and a number of Distinguished Service Cross winners, and they acquitted themselves very well.
Now, I don't know World War I particularly well, but I think Germany was actually doing very well up until close to the end of the war, and then all of a sudden things went downhill rapidly. So that's why
what happened with Germans is this, thumbnail sketch for your listeners. The Germans launched a spring offensive in March of 1918, which they transferred a number of divisions from the Eastern Front because they had made peace with Russia, and they were hoping to turn the tide of the war and win the war with these extra troops and this big push before the American army could really be trained and mobilized to get into the fight. And initially the German offensive did very well. And this is the period where open warfare resumed. Now, since 1914, up until March of 1918, it was trench warfare in Western Europe, okay? Before trench warfare took hold, the armies of all the major powers fought what was called open warfare, combined arms maneuvers. They maneuvered, they advanced, they had fire support for their maneuver forces, and that's how wars were fought. When the armies adopted trench warfare and dug into these trenches that went all the way from the North Sea up down to Switzerland, the armies lost the tactical thinking, the ability of fighting maneuver mobile warfare. They adopted new doctrine and tactics that put a heavy emphasis on heavy artillery barrages that were pre-planned barrages that could just obliterate grid squares on a map. So when you're resuming mobile warfare, you really can't fight mobile warfare very well if you've got to have a tremendous number of heavy guns moving quickly and bringing up millions of rounds of ammunition. That doesn't work very well.
Right.
So when the Germans launched this offensive using mobile warfare doctrine and tactics, the Western Front returned to fighting mobile warfare in part.
Mm-hmm.
And the Germans, little by little, started retrograding and losing as the American forces entered into the fight.
Yeah.
So the Americans tipped the scale, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The Germans gambled and lost. They didn't get enough men into the fight to break the French and the British before the American army under General Pershing could get into the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what happened in 1918. So from March, April, May, June, July, the Germans are getting pushed further and further back. The morale in the German army is they realize they're going to lose the war. They realize it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Their big chance was in March, and they failed to achieve that big objective of breaking the Allies in March.
Mm-hmm.
And by April and May, the handwriting was on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
So when I said earlier that the top decision makers and generals believed the war was going to go on into the spring of 1919, that's what the thinking was.
Mm-hmm.
Germany itself, by the end of the war, was never invaded. The Germans never had a fight on their own homeland, okay? The Germans decided to get out of the war before their homeland was invaded. And so that's the November 11th armistice, as they realized they can't compete with the Allies anymore. They just don't have the resources and manpower and industrial capability to just do it anymore. They were being bled white. So the American Tank Corps, albeit the fact that it only had 3 battalions and was only in the war for a short time, it was in at a critical period at the end of the war that contributed to the success of American arms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it helped them.
But it by comparison with all the millions of men in Europe, it never got a lot of attention because it was such a small contribution.
Mm-hmm. You said something early on that made me realize something, which is at this point in 1918, driving motorized vehicles I don't think was a common skill. Cars had been around for a while, but I think that was the rich had cars, and they had taxis. There were taxis, but and planes too. I'm thinking planes and tanks. Both of them required driving skills that maybe not a lot of people had.
Well, the U.S. Army had a number of motor trucks. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Even though the Army had a lot of horse-drawn materials like field artillery,
mm-hmm.
they had modernized to the extent that they had a variety of motor vehicles, motorcycles, cars, trucks. Mm-hmm. So the Army had drivers.
Mm-hmm.
The Army had people that were versant enough, that could trained enough, that knew how to work on engines.
Mm-hmm.
That was not a problem in the Tank Corps. Training tank drivers actually was not a problem.
Okay.
And maintaining the tanks was not a big problem. They could train the men for that. It's just the tanks, as I indicated earlier, the Renault tanks, they were just suffering problems from getting put out of action or having treads break off that had to be repaired. And they couldn't stay in the fight as much as they would have liked to.
Mm-hmm. When did the Army bring motorcycles and trucks and other motorized vehicles into its force structure?
I'd have to actually look that up, but
okay.
By the time the AEF was being organized, they had incorporated motor vehicles in addition to animal-drawn vehicles.
Okay. Let me turn back towards the research you did. You already talked about the resources you gathered. What would you say was the most enjoyable part of this research?
Well, I think reading something that, or compiling this type of information where nobody else in the field has been doing it or done it to this extent, I found that to be exciting as a historian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just about any historian or any writer you ever meet would love to break a story, for instance, get something new that nobody else has done.
Mm-hmm.
And in many respects, as I indicated earlier, that's exactly the fortuitous circumstance I found myself in.
Mm-hmm.
I found myself having access to information that for some reason or other nobody else had access to.
Mm-hmm.
So that was very enjoyable. One of the things I want to advise you that was a bit of a challenge but also kind of fun is when I edit these reports, if I just reprinted these things the way they were printed, your readers would be scratching their heads saying, well, where is this and what's that? When these officers were writing these things, they were misspelling things left and right, especially the names of French towns, and just standardizing the nomenclature, making sure that there are enough explanatory endnotes to readers to explain what they were referring to. That's the bread and butter of what I do as a trained military historian.
Okay.
So that's the value added that I bring to a book like this, rather than just reprinting things and regurgitating them in exact form. I don't believe in doing that. So the official reports have been edited to standardize everything. I use the correct terminology for the name of a town throughout everybody's reports. I corrected everybody. Okay? And so if somebody's got a wrong name, I correct it and make sure it's the right name. Now, as an official historian, when I was working for the Army, I would do that when I was writing official history. What I don't do, I will not do that to a published news article, something written that's unofficial that somebody else wrote. So in George Patton's personal letters and the 20-some-odd news reports, I may have an endnote or a footnote saying that this is a wrong spelling or this is wrong, but I'm not actually going to change and correct something in an unofficial document.
Okay.
But the reader should be comforted in knowing that there's an explanation somewhere in the book telling you what the correct term is or what the correct answer is. And that's an enjoyable part of what I do as a military historian. It takes a certain amount of skill to know that something needs to be addressed. And some of the terminology and some of the acronyms, I'm here to tell you. When I worked for the Army, before I retired earlier this year, if you run into an acronym, you can usually find a code somewhere from World War II or World War I or this, that, or the other. But some of these acronyms, there's just no handbook to tell you what they are. and so it took a lot of digging to find them in some alternative sources, sometimes in some of these news articles that were printed in these obscure newspapers. But that's rewarding, being able to solve kind of a puzzle that way and explain something that's been lost. Because the Army, and not just the Army, but all the armed services, they use acronyms so often that a civilian audience their heads will turn. They don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And people in the military and the Department of Defense, they have to remind themselves you can't speak to civilians in acronyms. You got to tell them what this stuff means.
Right. Yeah.
So it's no different in World War I. When these officers were writing these personal experience reports, they're using acronyms. And some of them are easy to figure out, and some of them aren't. But I think I got them all.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few surprising things you came across. Is there any other surprising thing you might want to mention that you haven't talked about yet?
No, I think overall, just making sure that I included the type of material in the book for the kind of book that I would want to buy. So in the appendices, I have schematics from the actual reports from the Patton papers from World War I that show what each of the tanks by the Americans, or not just the Americans, but the British, look like. It shows the height, weight, the guns. I mean, it gives. If you're a junkie into weapons and equipment, the actual Army statistics on these things with the line drawings, so people can get a real good idea what the equipment was like. I've got a number of photographs in there that can give people an idea as well. And what I include is an entire list of all of the tank battalions that was supposed to be organized in the U.S. Army in World War I. And even though most of them were never organized, it's just a very impressive list to see what the Army was planning to do. So, again, from a perspective of what the book offers, it offers more than just the insights, the human interest stories of these individuals. And again, the official ones were never meant to be read by people outside of General Rockenbach's command.
Yeah.
And some of these officers wrote these lighthearted things that were kind of funny. Some of them were more serious. But, you know, you just get that, you're reading something written by some 20-year-old lieutenant. You know, the war just ended 2 or 3 weeks earlier, and it just takes you right there.
Yeah, that's cool.
You're just right there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a 100-year window has just opened, and you step through it. And if you didn't know any better, you think you were hearing these things at a local bar from some guy who was just in action a week or two ago.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So was there any particular issue or question that you had a lot that was really difficult to grapple with and come to a conclusion on, or maybe you still would like to get an answer on anything?
No, not really. My biggest challenge is simply that the publisher limited the size of the book.
Mm-hmm.
I would have liked to have included some more of the news articles, and 1 or 2 more of the reports. There was another report I mentioned about Major Roger Harrison's report from the 301st Tank Battalion.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there was another infantry officer advanced school report, which was rather lengthy by a tank officer, but it was just too long to include in the book. I mean, I just couldn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, no, that's the only regret is when you want to put more stuff in than you're allowed to.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very proud of prioritizing and putting the most important things in, the most relevant, and the kind of book that I would want to buy to put on my bookshelf if I was going to, dig into my wallet or my credit card to buy something like this.
Okay. I'm curious, and you don't have to answer it, I'm just curious if the book answers this, how difficult it was to actually move the tanks from wherever it was constructed to training sites and then on to the front line, because I imagine it wasn't the easiest
Well, it
thing.
was a challenge, but it's not as difficult as you might imagine. Tanks were mostly moved on rail cars. Okay? So you'll stage them up to a rail facility. That's where you're going to move them cross-country to the long haul. And then you're going to, take them off the trains and drive them, stage them for the last few miles. But that was not a big issue. I mean, getting the tanks where they needed to be was not a big issue. Keeping them in the fight due to maintenance problems was the issue, as I indicated earlier. That was the issue.
I imagine they required a pretty robust support network. As far
Yes,
as
they did.
Fuel,
Yes, they did.
lubricants, ammo, whatnot.
Yes, they did. And that was another problem, which is touched on in the reports, but I can just mention since you brought it up. When the American tanks were advancing beyond our infantry, and in some of the battles that the light tankers took part in, they were running out of fuel, and they couldn't stay in the fight because they ran out of fuel. And it took like a day or so to get more fuel up because the roads were just congested with everyone and their uncle moving up on this road, or it was not designed for everyone being on it all at once. And so that was a logistical challenge for the Army. That reminds me, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting. One of the reports was one of the second officer after Patton that was in the tank corps was a Captain Elgin Brain, B-R-A-I-N-E. And Captain Brain was put in charge of helping do the training, and he went over and examined, along with George Patton, they spent time looking at French operations, how the French did things. But Elgin Brain was the conduit sent from the AEF to go back to the United States for the U.S. Ordnance Department to build American tanks. Okay? So Brain goes into really very good detail on how he's going back to the U.S. with all these requirements to build our own better style Renault tank. And all of the challenges that he faced with the bureaucracy in Washington of trying to get this off the ground and trying to get the specifications and somebody in industry to actually build this stuff, because American industry was building everything for the war effort, and now this fellow is showing up with a brand new requirement for something we've never done before. And it's just got some interesting sidebars on there that they had some innovations the Americans wanted. And I think one of them that Brain mentioned was a compass that you could put on a swivel, and inside the tank you could see where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
And when the very first tanks showed up, the very first American tanks showed up in Europe, there were just a few of them. They got there in November, but they didn't actually get tested out until after the armistice. And one of the reports that somebody wrote said, well, who thought up this idea with this compass in here? Because all of the metal in the tank, it throws the magnets off. What kind of idiot thought this up? And so it was just kind of funny on the front end. Somebody came up with a requirement to put something in this American tank, but then when it gets to the field, the user sees it as some useless implement.
Yeah. Like that's never happened before.
But that's how these things are done.
Yeah.
You take your best shot at doing something, but since Americans up to that point hadn't actually used a tank, Elgin Brain didn't have any American experience to know what we needed and what we didn't. They just took their best theoretical shot on what we needed.
Yeah.
And so that part, that's one personal experience report that differs from the others, but it has to do with acquisition, and it's very, very interesting because I don't believe there's a lot of history from the personal experience side of how you were going to acquire tanks in World War I.
Okay. Since we're just coming up on time, I'll just ask a few more questions to wrap this up. What's your next writing project?
Well, actually, I just got a book deal for a book that's going to be published next year. Let me parenthetically explain about my writing projects.
Sure.
When I saw the book, the tank extracts at Fort Sill, that's something I knew I wanted to edit at some time in the future. What I've done pretty much for my last 4 or some odd books, I think this is my 4th or 5th book, I think it's my 4th, is I find things that have been lost or overlooked in military history that I think should be back in print, and I make an effort to do that.
Okay.
So my next book, which I just got a book deal on, I signed a contract for it a few weeks ago, is an interest of mine is women in military history.
Okay.
And the Russian Army in World War I really pioneered putting women into the ranks officially, rather than just having some women disguised as soldiers or going with their husbands or lovers. And I found a book written in Russian that I believe to be the first and maybe the only book allowed under the Soviet Union that talks about a Russian female soldier's experiences. It's actually a novel, but it was written by a female soldier in World War I. And I've had that translated and edited, and that's my next book project.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
And that's going to come out next year. And it's kind of equivalent to a Russian version of All Quiet on the Western Front.
Wow.
It's written in the same style and manner as that.
That sounds good. Where can people find your books and follow your writings and thoughts?
Well, the easiest thing to do is just type in my full name, Lawrence M. as in Martin, Lawrence M. Kaplan. You type it in on Amazon or you type it in on the internet, and I've got a few writings here and there. I did some work for PBS Television in New York a few years ago. They had a series, a 4-part series, or maybe it was 6-part series called Ground War. And so I was in touch with the webmaster who was over writing about that series on their website, and I contributed some writings, some background about the history of the evolution of combined arms warfare.
Okay.
So that's one place that's I've got some stuff online.
Okay.
I've done several talks about several of my books that are on C-SPAN. That's why if you just typed in my name, or my name and historian, that stuff might pop up.
Okay.
But pretty much just the existing books that I have are on Amazon. And several books I've also done that are just self-published Amazon books, not through conventional publishers. And if you've got a few seconds before we end, I'll tell you about one of them.
Sure.
One of them is the memoirs of the first Chief of Field Artillery, William Snow, in World War I. I recommended this book to the folks out at Fort Sill, where I used to work a few years ago. They were putting together a reading list, and the book was out of print. It's been out of print since 1941. Well, I had prepared a revised, updated version. I got a recently retired three-star general who used to be a chief of field artillery to write an introduction for it a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I told the folks at Fort Sill, I said, hey, look, you might want to consider putting this book on the reading list. I can probably get a publisher for my revised version if you have an interest for it.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave it to the chief of field artillery, a major general. He read it, said, put this on the reading list now. And I'm talking to these officers out there and say, the book's out of print. You can't put it on the reading list now. It's out of print. So I found a press that would reproduce it, that would edit, that would publish it.
Mm-hmm.
But they told me it would take a year and a half to get it out, and they were going to charge $20 a copy or $25 a copy for a print-on-demand paperback.
Oh, yeah.
I said, that's ridiculous. Forget that.
Mm-hmm.
So I popped my version on Amazon for $10 in about 3 or 4 days. So I'm not sure if they've redone their reading list out at Fort Sill, Oklahoma for the fire support community, but that's how that ended up on an Amazon's print-on-demand book. Is because a publisher, in my view, was just going to price gouge, readers on this thing. That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely ridiculous. But General Snow's memoirs, being the first chief of field artillery, in my view, they're just fascinating, and people don't know about them. The book's been out of print since 1941. And frankly, other than my copy on the internet, you can't find a copy anywhere. Maybe a used copy on eBay somewhere, but
right.
It's also a great story. It's how General Snow on this side of the Atlantic trained, mobilized, and equipped the field artillery branch of the Army to fight an artillery war in France, in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Cool, yeah. So that's all the questions I have. Do you have any final thoughts or words?
No, I just want to thank you for the time that you've given me to explain my book to who's ever going to be listening to this.
Okay.
And just to reiterate that if you know anybody that's interested in the history of armored warfare, this book should probably be on their reading list or on their bookshelf if they have a serious interest, because it fills a valuable void. The bird's eye view, the human interest side of soldiering in the tank corps in World War I.
Oh, yeah, I'd completely agree with that. It sounds really good. But, yeah, thank you for speaking with me.
Well, you're very welcome, Chris. Take care.
You too. Thank you for listening. One of the best ways to provide feedback on this podcast is to rate it on iTunes. Please let me know if you liked it, or give me a poor rating if you didn't like this podcast, and I can use that feedback to hopefully get better. Otherwise, please follow me on Instagram at Chris Alvarez War Scholar, on YouTube under War Scholar 1945, on Twitter at War Scholar, on Facebook under War Scholar, and you can find more information on my website, warscholar.org. Please remember, my name Chris does not have an H, so it's ChrisAlvarez. Thank you, and I hope you continue to enjoy this podcast.